All thoughts and opinions expressed on WRHU's Queerly Informed do not reflect the views of Hofstra University, the Board of Trustees, or Radio Hofstra University. All contrasting thoughts or suggestions can be sent to programming at wrhu.org or to Room 127 Herbert Hall, 111 Hofstra University, Hempstead, New York, 11549. Welcome to an interview installation of Queerly Informed. I'm Riley Horvath. Thank you for joining us. Today, I'm speaking to Dr. Kit Heyam. Dr. Heyam is an academic studying gender history. Based in the UK, Dr. Heyam is an educator, heritage practitioner, and award-nominated writer who dedicates their time to maintaining the intersection of queer existence and gender. They are the author of the book, Before We Were Trans, A New History of Gender. This book explores the hidden history of trans and non-binary figures throughout our world's history in order to highlight the shift in the way society has perceived the notion of gender with each passing century. They join me today to discuss their research, their insight on current gender dialogue, and to share insight on their next project. Would you be able to explain to the audience a bit about what it means to be a heritage practitioner and what you have your PhD in?
My PhD, which I finished in 2017 at the University of Leeds, was on how King Edward II got his queer reputation. So I completed it in a literature school, not a history school, because what makes up Edward II's reputation and what shaped the way that we think about him as a queer medieval monarch were mostly overwhelmingly literary texts, and the writing of his reputation was really a literary process where writers were far more concerned about what makes a good story than they were about facts. So I was interested in how engaging with people's feelings shapes how we think about history, and I suppose I've taken that forward into thinking about the methodologies that we use to approach queer and trans history more broadly. So more recently, my book Before We Were Trans is a history of gender nonconformity, which thinks about people who don't fit into modern and or Western trans categories, but who still tell us that gender has never been something that's unequivocally and deterministically tied to the body, or that we can't disrupt and challenge and play with. And at the moment, I'm working on my next book, which is a trans history of family, which I should be submitting at the end of the year.
When I was reading your book, I found all of the examples quite memorable. I was wondering if you had to pick only one person, who was the most memorable to you, and what does their life experience tell us about society's understanding of gender within their time?
Such a difficult question. I think my favorite person who I wrote about in the book, and the person who I guess stands as an inspiration for me still, is a figure who went sometimes by Thomas and sometimes by Thomasine Hall. They were born in the 17th century. They were born in Newcastle in the north of England, and then they emigrated to the very early colonies in North America. So what was at the time the very, very new colony of Virginia. We know about them historically because they get sent to court initially because of sex outside of marriage, but then the court quickly becomes preoccupied with what is this person's gender, or what is this person's sex in 17th century terms. And they are on legal record as saying, I am both man and woman, which for a person who was an indentured servant, so not an enslaved person, but someone in a relatively similar kind of legal power dynamic, someone with very, very little power in their society to say in a court of law in the 17th century, I find a really inspiring example of resilience. And I think what their history tells us is also something very interesting, because when they said, I am both man and woman, they meant both. I have an intersex body and I live sometimes as a man, sometimes as a woman. And they are a really good example of how the history of intersex people is entwined with the history of gender nonconforming people and trans history in a way that we don't always acknowledge, but that I think is essential for the liberation of both groups today, to acknowledge the shared history and the shared oppressions, but also the way that sometimes intersex people have been harmed by the way that trans people have kind of managed to secure the medical advances that we wanted, or the liberation that we wanted in the past. So seeing Thomas or Thomasine as a trans ancestor and an intersex ancestor as part of trans history and as part of intersex history is, I think, really important to honor that intersection and that entanglement.
I was wondering if you could touch on how intersex identities relate to non binary identities and how gender has been categorized and cataloged throughout history and how that's changed.
So when Thomas or Thomasine says, I am both man and woman, clearly that is understanding that you can live in a way outside of gender binaries, right? And I think that's really cool. And one of the reasons they were able to say that was partly because their society understood that sex could be fluid and could be malleable, and also because their society understood sex as something that was shaped and reshaped by the things that you did and the clothes that you wore. So one answer to how do we see the history of gender existing outside of binaries is to understand that gender hasn't always been something that we just think of in terms of this is your internal identity and it's fixed and it's stable. In many societies, it's shaped by the things that you do, the societal roles that you take on, the kind of sex you have, the kind of things that you wear. So in that sense, there are loads and loads of examples of societies that have understood and still understand gender outside of binary categories. I mean, to give another example, one of the other chapters in Before We Were Trans talks about the Japanese early modern category of wakashu, which is a category of people whose gender is not male or female, and that's determined by the kind of sex that they have, by which I mean sexual activity, not what their body's like. So the idea of a gender that doesn't fit into binary categories is being produced by a diversity of sexuality. So all these things are entangled, and all these things give us, I think, really good evidence that there's always been non-binary ways of thinking about gender.
You've touched on this a little bit, but I want to ask you about identity categories in contemporary society. The variety of identities displayed through your research show a consistent trend of gender expression and identities that fall well beyond what we typically see within trans discourse. Could you speak on how this could be important to highlight within the current discourse on the gender binary spectrum?
That's such a good point, I think. What we're suffering from today is what a lot of scholars have called transnormativity. So the idea that there is a best or most real or most authentic way to be trans. And that is really a product of our quite recent medical history. So many people probably know that the criteria we use to sort of determine whether someone is really trans today. So we think about, having a stable, not a fluid identity, having known for a very, very long time that you're trans, having tried to access all of the possible medical options that you might be able to access. Those ideas are diagnostic criteria from the 1950s, and they are specifically diagnostic criteria that were written with the aim of avoiding any kind of regret. It's actually been shown, the historian Beans Velocci has done some great work on this. It's been shown that the very early gender identity clinicians in the mid 20th century US and UK were really concerned that they were going to get sued if they let someone transition who turned up and regretted it later. So they organized all their criteria around gatekeeping as much as possible, and including gatekeeping people who they just didn't think were going to pass particularly well. Like if you're a trans woman who was too tall, that was it, you were probably out. So those criteria have left their mark on the way that trans people articulate ourselves, because they are how we get healthcare if we want healthcare. And they have seeped into wider discourse about what kind of trans identities we treat with the least suspicion. That's a real problem for trans people today, whose experiences, as you know, as we all know, are way more diverse than that. And it's also a problem when we start applying them to history, because it means we miss a lot of these much more interesting and much more diverse examples. And it's a problem interculturally as well, because those are criteria that really only suit a particular white Western way of understanding gender.
How has current discourse created an artificial lens to look through that limits the scope that gender is seen through, even within the LGBTQ plus community?
So the problem with when we take those criteria of what makes a really trans person in the present day, and then we try and apply them to history, is we only really are able to dig up a few individuals who conform to those criteria, who have to, they have to have existed after medical transition became available, so after the early 20th century, and they have to conform to Western understandings of gender. They have to conform to recent understandings of gender as separate from sex and gender identity as a kind of stable thing inside you, not as something that, as I said, can be reshaped by different social factors. And it gives us the impression, when we do that, that there are really only a very few trans people in history and that they all fit a very sort of narrow set of stereotypical criteria. I think that's really dangerous, partly because we want everyone to be able to see themselves in history, but mainly because all of the transphobic rhetoric that we're seeing in contemporary politics today is underpinned by the idea of newness. And if we play into the hands of those people who think that we're a new invention, then we put ourselves, I think, at great political risk. And much more productive and much more liberating is, I think, to take an approach to trans history that realizes that any history which proves that gender can be separate from the body is history that proves that we can think about gender in trans ways. And we have always been able to think about gender in trans ways. And that's a much more significant and liberating promise, I think.
You focus on individual examples of trans identities throughout history and specifically make it a point to let them kind of speak for themselves in the context of their specific cultures and common practices. Can you speak on the romanticization of different cultures through a westernized lens by white trans people that we often see today within the gender spectrum space, and how you came to the conclusion that it was most appropriate to let the history speak on its own outside of a westernized perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I came out as non-binary, which was like slightly sort of before the curve of non-binary identities being a bit more widely recognized, so I came out in 2014, the arguments that non-binary people were using to prove the validity of their own identities were often based on kind of pulling examples from other cultures. So like, have you heard of the Hydra? Have you heard of two-spirit people? This proves that gender isn't binary, and so my identity is real. And I quickly began to feel a discomfort with that, as did a lot of other historians and activists, because of the way that way of thinking is just using people from non-Western cultures to prove the validity of our own identities without sort of trying to engage meaningfully with the voices or the demands or the needs of people from those communities today, and without also asking whether our experiences are really the same as theirs. My experience as a white non-binary person is not at all the same as a two-spirit person's. And I really, when I was starting to write Before We Were Trans, and I knew it was going to be a global history, I really wanted to find a way of thinking and writing about those histories from cultures that weren't my own without falling into that trap. And the decision I made was to write about people on their own historical and cultural terms, and to lean into the ways in which sometimes that was difficult for me, or I couldn't empathize with it, or I found it really hard to get my head around. I think it's productive and important that as white trans people, we kind of model and are open about the discomfort that sometimes we face when we're trying to get our heads around stuff that culturally we can't empathize with, because otherwise we don't leave space for the fact that there are differences and there are nuances, and actually leaning into those is an important part of respecting everybody's experience equally.
It's widely acknowledged in LGBTQ+ spaces that representation is extremely beneficial, if not necessary, to queer youth in order for them to feel connected to their identities and empowered to live fulfilling lives. Especially for those who don't have representation in their day-to-day lives, history and media is the only representation many have access to, despite almost entirely being portrayed through a westernized lens. In your opinion, what is the main difference, if there is one, in looking to these portrayals for representation and enforcing a westernized lens onto a cultural practice to fill a narrative?
I would never want to tell someone that they shouldn't be engaging with media that is really important to them, even if it is media made by white people about cultural experiences that, that aren't ours. But I think I would also want to encourage people to seek out a diversity of media made by creators from different cultures and different gendered experiences. And to ask your local bookshop and your local queer film festival, if you have one, about things like that. One of the things I do other than writing is help to coordinate my local queer film festival, and one of our key aims is to platform the work of people who are most marginalized within queer communities, because that actually usually is the creators of color and the creators who are not from Europe or the US, who are telling stories through their own cultural lens about their own histories and not necessarily being able to be heard. So I want to leave space for and show lots of compassion for particularly queer youth who are really, particularly in our contemporary political climate, finding any way they can to sustain themselves. But I also want to encourage everyone to seek out media made by creators of lots of different kinds of cultural gendered experience, because that can only increase the solidarity that we can have for each other, I guess.
I want to touch on the human perspective a little. The human perspective is so inherently biased and dependent on the life experiences of a specific individual. Has your research reflected the possibility of a non-politicized gender narrative, or would you argue that there has always been people opposed to the idea of a gender spectrum?
I don't think there have always been people opposed to the idea of a gender spectrum. I think that there are particular forces that work to encourage people to oppose it. One of the main ones of those is patriarchal thought, which obviously is baked into quite a lot of particularly Abrahamic religions. And because man and woman have always been power categories as well as identity categories, if you are someone who is benefiting from those power categories, you are always going to resist the diversification and the dissolution of them. So I think because of that, and because of the, as I say, the entanglement of that with particular strands of religious thought, that has meant that within societies where those strands of religious thought are important, yes, there probably always have been people who are opposed to it, but there are plenty of societies that don't have those ways of thinking. And so I suppose there have on the planet always been people who are opposed to thinking about gender as a spectrum, but I don't think in every society.
Do you think the colonial weaponization of religion is partially responsible for the shift to a two-sex, two-gender bias within our current society?
There's loads we could say about that. I think one of the things I've been looking into more in the book I'm writing about family is the development of our contemporary ideas about quote unquote biological sex, and the fact that all of our scientific ideas about sex emerged in a period where, number one, the ideology of men and women having separate spheres, so men being working in public, women being in private in the home, that was developing at the same time. And number two, science was being used to justify colonial practices and enslavement by entrenching the idea that there were biologically different kinds of humans. So people of color were biologically different, and therefore you can justify treating them badly. Likewise, women, biologically different, you can justify treating them badly. So our contemporary ideas of biological sex were shaped by the time period in which they were coming together. And that was a time period in which those colonial ideas and those patriarchal ideas were crystallizing in a particular way. And Fausto Sterling says biology is politics by other means. And I think that's a really succinct way of putting what I just said.
Based on your familiarity with the ways gender has been politicized historically, would you be able to give any commentary or potentially draw any parallels regarding previous gender-related political actions and the current impact the democratic backsliding is having on the trans community on a global level?
One parallel I would want to draw is around the period in which those ideas of biological sex were developing, which was from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century. That was a period in which women were starting to fight for their rights. So starting to insist on equal pay, on the vote, on the ability to work outside the home. And the insistence by mostly male, mostly white scientists that biology showed that women were inherently different from men was an attempt to stabilize the gender order in society. So if women are going to go out to work, well, at least we can claim that that's not natural, you know. And I think there's a real parallel to be drawn between those anxieties and the anxieties that is very clear many male politicians and the men who vote for them are having now about the increasing equality between genders and the response that they're having in trying to quote unquote stabilize the societal order. I think the other thing that it's useful to say about contemporary political responses to trans life and contemporary political attempts to eradicate trans life is that a lot of the appeals, and Judith Butler makes this point in their recent book about gender too, a lot of the appeals to, the way things used to be and the way that families used to be and the way that men and women used to be are also based on economic crisis. So they're based on the idea that like it used to be possible for one person's wage to prop up an entire family and pay rent, and now it's not. And so I think history tells us that this is kind of just as much about capitalism as it is about gender, and therefore that the solution has to be to do with capitalism as well as it has to do with gender.
Thank you. If someone were to take one thing away from your book, what would you want them to focus on?
I think I would want them to take away the fact that the body has never limited who a person can be, and therefore the body never has to limit who a person can be. And I think that should be a transformative way to think.
And would you like to discuss any future or current projects, any social media?
So the book I'm writing right now won't be out till 2027, but I would love to plug a couple of things that are sooner. Next month, I've co-edited a book with a colleague, John Ward, called New and Decolonial Approaches to Gender Nonconformity, which is a collection of cutting-edge scholarship thinking about gender nonconformity and decolonial thought. And that's going to be open access, so look it up. You can get it for free, as well as paying for it if you want. And also I co-wrote, if anyone is interested in history or museum work, I co-wrote a toolkit called Gendering the Museum with a colleague, James Daybell, and you can Google that and get that for free as well.
Thank you for tuning in to Queerly Informed this week on 88.7 FM Radio Hofstra University, Spotify, iTunes, and YouTube. Thank you to the entire Queerly Informed team for your work on this week's edition. Also, a huge thank you goes out to Dr. Kit Heyam for joining us on today's Queerly Informed interview installation. Join us back here next week to hear the latest in queer news, as well as commentary from our group of LGBTQ+ reporters. As always, if you have any suggestions for stories or content that you would like to hear, send them our way through email at queerlyinformedwrhu@gmail.com. For Queerly Informed, I'm Riley Horvath. Thank you for tuning in.